Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you are doing well, guys. It's a Sunday. It's a terrible day here in Ireland. I hope it is a better day wherever you are. I mean, weather-wise. It is really pretty gross outside. Let's just discuss the question of Jordan Peterson's type. Some of you may know that I have actually released a video. I released a video back in the day about 2 years ago, where I essentially was saying that Peterson was most likely either an ENFJ or an INFJ. Back in the day, I think the consensus, in fact, to call it a consensus would be an exaggeration, because there's never actually been a consensus around Jordan Peterson's type. It's heavily contested, as far as I understand these days. It's enough to look at the personality database page for Peterson. It's heavily contested between, INFJ, which seems to be the dominant type for him still, ENTP and INTP. ENFJ votes are lower in the rankings of the votes. There are some votes that say ENFJ, and that's kind of where I was oriented back then. I mentioned INFJ as a possibility, but I was sort of tempted to kind of favor ENFJ. But I have to say my position has changed since then, partly because I've had some interesting discussions with other people, and sometimes it's great to have a conversation with someone and to sort of just listen to their rational arguments for why you might be wrong, and I always try to do that. And I have become convinced by that argument, essentially saying that Jordan Peterson is most likely an ENTP. Now, what's interesting about this duality of approaches between INFJ and ENTP is that I think it usefully brings back the focus on the many similarities that there are between these two types. It's these two types are often discussed when people look into relationship dynamics, provide relationship advice. It is supposedly the case that INFJs and ENTPs are quite well matched, just in the same way that they're well matched with INTPs and ENFPs. That those are pairings that you'd come across quite often. And so in that context, you see the INFJ and the ENTP being discussed together, but not as often in terms of how similar their function stacks are. When it's about relationships, the implication is that the function stacks are complementary, but not necessarily similar, because an ENFP, for example, has a very different stack from an INFJ, and they're still complementary. But in the case of Peterson, I think that this is revealing, because in him, the TI and the FE are clearly noticeable. The intuition is clearly noticeable. It's a little bit less clear whether I think he's a perceiver or a judger. If you were to look simply at his work ethic, how he organizes his life, his industriousness, just the amount of meetings he's got scheduled all the time. He burnt out because of that, among other things, not long ago, and I'm happy to hear that he's doing well again. But those seem to be, at first sight, superficially the signs of a J-type, but we well know that that's a kind of superficial understanding of what a J-type is, and INFJs, for example, are not good with these things in their J-types. And of course, when you look at some of the world's most influential CEOs, like the Google, or founders of Google, they're not CEOs technically, but Larry Page and these people and others, INTPs, they must have a spectacular work ethic. They must have unbelievable organizational skills. So again, the distinction between J and P along those lines is kind of a superficial one, and it can only help to a degree, but not further than that. And so I think that in the case of Peterson, that doesn't actually justify just considering him a J-type. In fact, if anything, just the prodigious amount of things he does and the people he meets and endeavors he engages in, the amazing, just amount of energy that he invests in all these different things and these different channels of his work. There are so many different ones. To me, that really just indicates, if it indicates anything, it doesn't indicate that he's a J-type, but more that he's an extrovert. I think it's quite hard to picture Peterson being an introvert, to be honest. I was kind of on the fence about that idea last time I discussed this type, and I still am. I think that in every possible way in which I kind of see him interact with people, I see more the extroverts at work. This kind of this kind of interest in keeping busy and engaging in a lot of different, like I said, channels to spend his energy, basically. And I think that's probably indicative of NE rather than NI when you think about it. But the difference between NI and NE is a bit more subtle, because it's true that if you look at a lot of his lectures on the surface, there seems to be a fair bit of NI, especially when he discusses the likes of Jung. But I think that there's a difference between being influenced by an author to a large extent, to a deep extent, and then the way in which you impart the knowledge to your students or to your viewers on YouTube or to an audience of any kind. And it is true that having listened to some of the episodes from the podcast, it becomes quite clear that he's an NE user. Just for his extremely digressive approach. He's quite digressive. He goes into long narrative examples and sometimes just jumps up and digresses. Very virtuosically, but nevertheless digresses, and then just goes anyway. The anyway that he always uses, and then goes back to the topic and resumes from there. So I think that there's more NE than NI at work, actually, even though a lot of what he discusses, I think, has been garnered from reading NI authors. If you can sort of make sense of that subtle distinction. There's also the question of TI and FE in Peterson. I think, the arguments of the INFJ defenders, the people who are defending the INFJ position in regards to Peterson, is that, yeah, sure, his TI is quite strong, but, there are lots of NITI INFJs, so why could you not just be an NITI INFJs? And the problem is, again, that people don't pay attention to the fact that you can be an NITI INFJ. I'm willing to admit that to an extent, to an extent only. Like, it's a little bit slippery to start talking too often and too comfortably about NITI INFJs, because INFJs are NIFE, they're not NITI primarily. You can sort of, in a manner of speaking, refer to INFJs who who rely a lot on TI as NITI INFJs, but the thing is, even in NITI INFJs, right, where you're going to see all the TI that you're going to see a lot is tertiary TI, it's not auxiliary TI. So quantitatively, you might see as much TI as you see FE, but qualitatively, you will not see auxiliary TI. So let me just put it a different way. Compared to an ENTP, an INFJ, imagine that you have an ENTP whose TI for some reason is a little bit repressed. It's possible, of course. And next to that ENTP, you put like an INFJ whose the FE is a little bit repressed and whose TI is quite developed and strong. The ENTP might display TI less, but when he displays the TI or she displays the TI, it will be qualitatively auxiliary, whereas in the case of the INFJ, it will be qualitatively tertiary. So it's not enough to say, oh, like Peterson is an NITI INFJ. You have to look at the TI manifest, and it's quite clear when you look at the way he manifests TI that it is more of an auxiliary function than it is a tertiary function for him, because it's really it really structures his thought like to such an important extent. It's like when he's talking, he's trying to visualize something in front of him and organize it with his TI. It's quite clear to me now that it's an NE and TI at work. But keep in mind, an NITI INFJ is going to still display tertiary TI. The tertiary TI is different. It's not quite as obviously rational as an auxiliary TI of an ENTP. It's always going to be a little bit more mystical, always going to be a little bit attracted to paradox. There's that idea of the child TI. And that's even the case if the TI is very prominent. And you just have to look at the example of Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose TI was remarkable, but a tertiary TI nonetheless. And if you read his works, you'll notice that. And I think that in Peterson, that's what you see. And you will not be able to find the example of a single INFJ whose TI doesn't manifest as tertiary, because otherwise he wouldn't be an INFJ. Right, this video has already been lasting for a while, so final verdicts, Peterson, ENTP, let me know what you think. Ciao.